The wind howled across the barren Montana plains as the train screeched into the station, the iron wheels grinding against the tracks with a shudder that rattled the few passengers who had dared to travel this far west. Among them sat a young woman, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart beating with the nervous rhythm of a clock wound too tightly. Her name was Clara Evans, 23 years old, raised in a Boston orphanage where dreams were a luxury and hope was something borrowed, never owned. For years, she had watched couples pass by on the cobbled streets, wives carrying baskets of bread, husbands tipping their hats, children giggling between them, and each time, Clara felt an ache in her chest so strong she thought it might break her in two. When the matron of the orphanage had pressed the advertisement into her hand, mail-order brides, needed in the Western Territories, wives for honest men seeking companionship and families, Clara had laughed bitterly, believing no man in his right mind would ever ask for her. She was plain, she told herself, her auburn hair too wild, her freckles too many, her eyes too serious for laughter. And yet a spark of something reckless, desperate, perhaps even hopeful, had driven her to write a letter. She had written of her willingness to work hard, her desire to be a good wife, her longing for a family of her own. Weeks passed, then months, with no reply until at last one envelope arrived from a rancher named Thomas McAllister. His words had been sparse, almost stiff, but kind. He spoke of his ranch, of the hardships of winter, of his need for a partner who could endure the rugged life. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had a daughter, Mary, a child of 5 years whose mother had died 3 winters ago. He did not ask for beauty or accomplishments, only for honesty, endurance, and a willingness to share his life. And so Clara had packed the few belongings she owned, boarded the train, and travelled further than she had ever dreamed possible, clutching the hope that perhaps, at last, she might belong somewhere. But as the train hissed to a stop and the conductor shouted for passengers to disembark, Clara's confidence faltered. The platform was almost empty, save for a few rough men hauling freight and a group of children, chasing each other through the dust. She stepped down carefully, adjusting her worn coat against the sharp wind, scanning the crowd for a man who might be Thomas McAllister. She imagined him broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and labor, perhaps older than most, perhaps still carrying the shadow of his loss. But no one approached her. Minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last, until the platform emptied and the train let out its final whistle, preparing to move on. Clara's throat tightened. What if he had changed his mind? What if he had taken one look at her letter or her picture and decided she wasn't worth the trouble? What if she had traveled across the country only to find herself unwanted, abandoned, a fool? She clutched her carpet-bag tighter, blinking back the tears that stung her eyes, when she heard a small, hesitant voice behind her. Are you Miss Clara?" She turned, startled, and found herself staring into the wide, blue eyes of a little girl no taller than her waist. The child had golden curls tangled by the wind, her cheeks flushed pink, her small hands clutching the edge of a shawl that looked too large for her. Clara's heart lurched as the girl peered up at her with a mixture of shyness and determination. "My papa, he said you might come," the little one whispered, as though afraid that saying it too loudly might make it untrue. Clara dropped to her knees so their eyes were level, her carpet-bag forgotten at her feet. "Yes," she managed, her voice trembling. "I'm Clara, and you must be Mary." The little girl nodded, and then, with a breath so soft it was almost carried away by the wind, she leaned closer and whispered the words that would change Clara's life forever. "Can you be my mommy?" For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Clara felt her heart break open, not in sorrow, but in an overwhelming rush of tenderness she had never known. She was capable of. She gathered Mary into her arms, holding her tightly as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I will try with all my heart." And in that instant, the loneliness that had haunted her since childhood lifted, replaced by something fierce and fragile, love, raw and unexpected. It was only then that she heard footsteps behind her, heavy and measured, and when she looked up, she saw him, Thomas McAllister. He was taller than she had imagined, his shoulders broad beneath a worn coat, his face rugged and sun-browned, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He stood watching them, his expression unreadable, as though he did not know whether to welcome or retreat. Clara rose slowly, her hands still holding Mary's, her pulse racing with nerves. Thomas tipped his hat, his voice deep and gravelly. "Miss Evans," he said simply. She nodded, her own voice catching. "Mr. McAllister." The silence stretched, filled only by the restless wind and Mary's small hand squeezing hers. And so began Clara's new life, one that would test her strength, challenge her heart, and teach her that sometimes, when you believe no one wants you, it is then that love finds you in the most unexpected way. The first weeks on the McAllister ranch tested Clara in ways she had never imagined. Each day a relentless cycle of dawn to dusk labor, biting cold winds and the quiet, unspoken distance that stretched between herself and Thomas, a gulf bridged only by the small, bright presence of little Mary, who clung to her hand, her skirts, and her heart with a devotion that both comforted and terrified Clara, for she feared she might somehow fail this child, who had so bravely asked her to be her mother. Clara rose each morning before the sun, her breath clouding in the frozen air as she stoked the fire, fetched water, and set bread to bake, her hands roughening with the work yet steady in their determination. And though Thomas offered her polite words of thanks, his eyes rarely lingered, as if he dared not allow himself the softness of attachment, as if some part of him still held too tightly to the memory of the wife he had lost, the woman whose absence had carved such deep lines of sorrow into his face. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm of life began to change. Mary's laughter echoed. Through the once silent house, the hearth seemed warmer for Clara's presence, and though Thomas tried to hide it, his gaze would sometimes soften when he returned from the fields and found his daughter curled up in Clara's lap, listening to a story, her head resting against the steady beat of a heart that was learning, day by day, what it meant to belong. The townsfolk, however, were not so easily convinced, for whispers travelled quickly in small communities, and Clara could feel their eyes upon her whenever she ventured into town, hear their murmurs, a bride by mail. Imagine that, some pitying, some scornful, others doubtful that she would last the winter, and each remark was a thorn that pricked her fragile confidence. Though she never let Mary see the tears she shed in secret, still, in her quiet way, Clara resolved to endure, for she knew that love was not something handed freely, but something earned with patience, sacrifice, and courage. It was one evening after a long day of mending clothes and tending chickens that the fragile threads of their lives began to weave into something stronger. A storm had rolled in from the mountains, fierce and unyielding, and when Thomas returned late, his coat heavy with snow, he found Clara in the kitchen with Mary perched upon the table, helping her knead dough with tiny flour-dusted fingers, both of them laughing so hard they barely noticed the wind, rattling the shutters. For the first time, Thomas stood in the doorway and did not feel the aching hollow of absence, but rather a stirring of something he thought had been buried with his wife, a sense of home, of warmth, of possibility. He said little, as was his way, but when Clara glanced up, their eyes met, and in that brief, unguarded moment, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer strangers, bound by paper and distance, but two souls tentatively stepping toward the same future. The weeks that followed brought trials enough to test that fragile bond, a neighbor's cattle, straying into their pasture, Mary falling ill with a fever that kept Clara awake by her bedside for 3 nights straight, Thomas's stubborn pride clashing with Clara's quiet strength. But through each challenge, Clara proved herself again and again, not with grand gestures, but with steadfast devotion, the kind that wove itself into the very fabric of their lives until even Thomas could no longer deny that she was not simply a guest in his home, but the heart of it. And yet, It was Mary who bound them together most of all, for the little girl, with her innocent questions and open love, reminded them both of what mattered most. One night as Clara tucked her into bed, Mary whispered sleepily, "Papa smiles more now, because of you." And though Clara's eyes filled with tears at the thought, she knew it was true, for Thomas's guardedness had begun to soften, his silences less heavy, his presence more attentive, and once, as Clara sat sewing by lamplight, she felt his hand rest briefly on hers, rough and calloused but warm with unspoken gratitude. The journey from strangers to family was not swift, nor without setbacks. Doubts lingered, grief still haunted, and the land itself offered hardship at every turn. But like the slow thaw of winter into spring, love crept into their lives, quiet but unstoppable, until Clara, who once believed no one wanted her, realized that she had not only found a place to belong, but had become the very center of it. And so the story of Clara and the McAllisters unfolded, not with fanfare or perfection, but with the tender, imperfect beauty of real love, forged in the crucible of hardship and hope. A reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come not when we seek them, but when we least expect them, carried on the whispers of a child's heart. And if you, dear listener, have been touched by Clara's journey from loneliness to belonging, from doubt to love, then I invite you to stay with us, to subscribe, and to be part of many more stories like this. Tales that remind us all that no matter how forgotten or unwanted we may feel, there is always a place where we are meant to be. Always a voice, perhaps small and tender like Mary's, waiting to whisper, "Can you be mine?" And in that whisper, to discover the love we never dared believe was ours.